My son-in-law threw my birthday cake in the trash at the party, right in front of everyone. He looked at me and laughed. My daughter said nothing. I picked up my napkin, wiped my hands, and walked outside. I made one phone call. By Monday morning, everything had changed. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I am and how I got here. My name is Howard. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a commercial real estate consulting firm in Columbus, Ohio. Not inherited money, not lucky money. Money that came from 7-day work weeks, missed Little League games, cold dinners reheated at 9 o'clock at night, and more flights to cities I didn't care about than I can count. I built something real, and the person I built it mostly for was my daughter, Claire. Claire's mother, my wife Sandra, passed away when Claire was 11. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the last breath. I held Claire on the bathroom floor of our house on Elm Grove the night Sandra died, and I made a silent promise that I would never let that little girl feel alone in this world, not for a single day. I kept that promise. Maybe too well. Claire grew up understanding that whatever she needed, I would provide. When she wanted to study fashion marketing in New York instead of staying closer to home, I said yes. When she needed first and last month's rent on an apartment in Brooklyn, I said yes. When she came home for Christmas, her senior year wearing a coat that cost more than my first car, I said nothing. She was happy. Sandra would have wanted her to be happy. That was enough for me. She met Kyle during her second year in New York. He was 32. She was 24. He worked in sales for a tech startup. Confident, loud, always the most talkative person in any room. The first time I met him at a dinner in the city, he spent 45 minutes explaining to me why Columbus was a dying market and why anyone serious about money should be in New York or Miami. I smiled. I ordered the halibut. I said very little. Claire looked at him like he was the smartest man she'd ever seen. I told myself that was enough. They got engaged 18 months later. I paid for the engagement party. I paid for the wedding, a venue in the Hudson Valley that ran me a little over $90,000, not including the rehearsal dinner. I paid for their honeymoon in Portugal. When they moved to a 2-bedroom in Hoboken, I quietly covered the down payment, $112,000, wired without fanfare, because that's what fathers do. Because Sandra wasn't here to see her daughter get married, and I wanted everything to be beautiful. Kyle thanked me exactly once. In a text message. Thanks, Howard. Appreciate it. Not Mr. Kellerman. Not Dad. Howard. I let it go. What I couldn't let go, what I tried to let go and couldn't, was the way he spoke to me when Claire wasn't paying attention. Little things. Dismissive things. At Thanksgiving, when I offered to help carry dishes from the kitchen, he said, "We got it. Just sit down," like I was a child underfoot. At Claire's birthday dinner the following spring, he interrupted me 3 times while I was telling a story, and each time Claire laughed like it was charming. I started to understand the shape of what was happening. I just didn't know how bad it would get. My 63rd birthday fell on a Saturday in October. Claire suggested we celebrate at their house in Hoboken. They'd had it repainted, she said, and she wanted to show it off. She told me to come at 6. She said it would be small, just family and a couple of their friends. I drove up from Columbus. 4.5 hours. I brought flowers for Claire and a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle I'd been saving for a special occasion. I wore a sport coat. I was in a good mood. There were 14 people in the apartment when I arrived. I knew 3 of them. The rest were Kyle's friends from work, young, loud, drinking things that came in cans. Kyle had set up a speaker in the corner that was playing music at a volume that made conversation difficult. I found a chair near the window and tried to make myself comfortable. At some point, Claire brought out a cake, white with blue frosting. She'd ordered it from a bakery downtown. It said, "Happy birthday, Dad," across the top. She carried it over to where I was sitting and set it on the coffee table, and a few people gathered around, and someone started singing, and for a moment it was genuinely nice. I felt warm. I thought about Sandra. I wondered if she could see us. Then Kyle walked over. He looked at the cake. He looked at me. He looked at his friends. And then he said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "You know he's been living off my wife's goodwill for years, right? Guy acts like a king, but Claire's the one who actually earns it." The room went quiet. I thought I'd misheard him. I turned and looked at him. He wasn't joking. His expression was flat and certain, the face of someone who'd been wanting to say something for a long time and had finally decided the moment was right. I started to speak. He picked up the cake. He walked to the kitchen and dropped it in the trash can. Just set it down in there like it was garbage. Then he turned around and said, "We're done babying you." "Claire agrees. You've had a good run." I looked at my daughter. She looked at the floor. She said, "Dad, Kyle and I have talked about this. We think it's time for some boundaries." I sat there for a long moment. The music was still playing. One of Kyle's friends was looking at his phone. I could hear the city outside the window. I stood up. I put on my coat. I picked up the bottle of Pappy Van Winkle because I hadn't brought it for this. I shook nobody's hand. I walked to the door. Claire said, "Dad." I said, "I'll call you." I took the elevator down to the lobby. I pushed through the glass door onto the sidewalk. It was cold outside, that particular October cold that comes in off the Hudson and means business. I stood there for a moment. And then I took out my phone and I called my attorney, Frank Delgado, in Columbus. Frank has been my attorney for 22 years. He picked up on the second ring, which tells you something about Frank. I said, "Frank, I need to make some changes. All of them. Tonight." He said, "I'll be at the office in an hour." I drove home. Sunday I spent mostly alone. I walked the neighborhood. I made coffee. I looked at a photograph of Sandra that sits on the bookshelf in my study. She's laughing at something off camera, wearing a blue dress, maybe 34 years old. I thought about the promise I made on the bathroom floor. I thought about whether I'd kept it or whether I'd only kept half of it, the comfortable half, and let the other half go unattended until it became something neither of us would have recognized. The changes I had Frank draft were not done in anger. I want to be clear about that. I did not sit down and think about how to hurt my daughter or embarrass her husband. I sat down and thought about what was honest, and then I asked Frank to make the honest thing legal. I removed Kyle and Claire as beneficiaries on my estate. I restructured the trust I'd set up for Claire 6 years earlier. She would retain access to it at 65, as originally planned, but the quarterly distributions I'd been sending, $2,200 every 3 months, without fail since she turned 22, those stopped. I contacted Gerald Park at Apex Commercial Realty. Kyle had gotten his current job partly through a relationship I'd cultivated with a man named Dennis Voigt, who ran the startup's parent company. Dennis and I had done 3 deals together. Good deals. I called Dennis and I told him quietly and without drama that I was reevaluating some of my professional relationships and that I wanted him to know, as a courtesy, that Kyle was no longer connected to my circle in any way. I didn't ask Dennis to do anything. I simply informed him of a fact. Dennis is a careful man. He draws his own conclusions. I also called Margaret Chen, who runs a charitable foundation I've been involved with for 11 years. I've been planning to name the foundation as a secondary beneficiary on a policy that would have generated a significant gift. I told Margaret that plan was unchanged, but I asked her, as a personal favor, to share the news of my philanthropic intentions with the Columbus Business Journal, which she was already planning to do. I asked her to move the timeline up. I mention that detail because it matters later. Monday morning, Kyle's startup announced a restructuring. Dennis's company, which held a significant stake, had communicated through its board that they were taking a more active role in personnel decisions. Kyle's position was reclassified. His title changed. By Wednesday, he was in a different role entirely, still employed, technically, but no longer on the track he'd been on. No longer the rising star in the story he'd been telling himself. I don't know exactly what Dennis said. I don't need to know. I made one call as a courtesy to a man who draws his own conclusions. I found out about Kyle's situation not from Claire, but from my accountant, who had heard it from someone at a networking event. I said nothing when I heard it. I made a note and went back to work. 3 weeks after my birthday, Claire called me. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was about 2 minutes long. Her voice sounded different. Smaller somehow, the way voices get when the ground is shifted. She said she wanted to talk. She said Kyle was under a lot of pressure. She said she felt like things had gotten out of control. She said she missed me. She did not say she was sorry. I called her back the next afternoon. We talked for 40 minutes. I was honest with her. I told her what I'd seen over the years, not just at my birthday, but the small things, the way she'd looked at the floor, the way she'd let moments go by without saying anything. I told her that I had not cut her off to punish her. I told her that I had cut off the money because I realized on that sidewalk in Hoboken with the October wind in my face that the money was the problem, that I had used it without meaning to buy a piece that wasn't real. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I knew it was wrong at the party. I knew and I didn't say anything." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said I was. I told her I'd been walking every morning and that I'd started going to the early service at church again, something I'd let slide for years. I told her Columbus in October was beautiful in a way that New York didn't have room for. I told her I'd cooked dinner for Frank and his wife the previous Friday, and that Frank's wife had asked for my chili recipe, which I considered a significant personal victory. Claire laughed. It was a real laugh. I hadn't heard that in a while. She asked if she could visit. She said alone, just her, not Kyle. She said she needed some time to think, and that she thought being home might help. She came the second weekend in November. She slept in her old room. I made pancakes Saturday morning and we sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular. About her job, which she actually liked. About a podcast she'd been listening to. About the neighborhood here and how much had changed since she was in high school. At some point, she picked up the framed photo of her mother from the bookshelf and held it for a while. She said, "Do you think she'd be disappointed in me?" I said, "I think she'd be proud of the fact that you came back." That evening, we sat on the back porch with blankets and coffee, and she told me about the last 2 years. About the ways she'd made herself smaller to keep the peace at home. About how Kyle's certainty had, over time, felt less like confidence and less like something she wanted to be near. She didn't say their marriage was over, but she said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. I've learned, late in life, that the most useful thing a father can do is sometimes just stay quiet and let his child find the thought on her own. Before she drove back Sunday afternoon, she stood in the driveway and hugged me for a long time. She said she was sorry. Not for anything specific, just sorry, which I understood to be the real kind. The kind that doesn't come with an explanation, because the explanation would take too long. I said, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to show up." She nodded. She got in the car. She drove away. I stood in the driveway for a minute before going inside. That was 4 months ago. Claire and Kyle are still married, still working through things. She started seeing a therapist in January, and from what she's told me, it's helping. Kyle and I have not spoken. I don't know if we will. I'm comfortable not knowing. What I do know is this. I spent 11 years after Sandra died trying to hold our family together with money, because money was the one language I was sure I could speak. It was the tool I understood. What I didn't understand was that somewhere along the way, the tool became a substitute for the harder thing, which is saying out loud what you need and what you will not accept. On that sidewalk in Hoboken, with my birthday cake in someone's trash can and my daughter looking at the floor, I understood it. You can love someone completely and still be doing them harm by never letting them feel the weight of a consequence. It is not cruelty to stop catching someone every time they fall. It is, actually, the last and most difficult form of love. Margaret Chen called me last month. The Columbus Business Journal piece ran, and she said the response had been wonderful. Several people had reached out about the foundation, and one family had announced a matching gift. She said she was grateful. I told her the gratitude was mine. I'm 63. I walk 4 miles every morning. I cook dinner on Fridays. I go to the early service on Sundays. I have a daughter who calls me twice a week now, real calls, long ones, the kind where neither of us is performing anything. And somewhere in New Jersey, I believe my son-in-law is learning, slowly, what it means to stand on ground that belongs to him and not to someone else. I don't wish him harm. I genuinely don't. I wish him the experience of building something with his own hands because I think it's the only thing that might teach him the thing he still needs to learn. I wiped my hands and walked out. I made one call. That was enough. I've thought a lot about what I would tell a younger version of myself, not the version who was building the business, or the one who was sitting at Sandra's bedside, or even the one driving home from Columbus to Hoboken on a cold October night with a bottle of whiskey on the passenger seat and nothing else to show for the evening. I mean the version who was writing checks and calling it love. That version needed to hear something he wasn't ready to hear. Here's what I know now. Consequences are not cruelty. Letting someone feel the full weight of their own choices is not punishment. It is the most honest thing you can offer another person. I spent years absorbing consequences on Claire's behalf. Every time she needed a cushion, I was there. I thought that was what good fathers did. And maybe it was, for a while. But at some point, the cushion became the whole floor, and she forgot what it felt like to stand on something she built herself. Kyle was a symptom. He was loud and certain and dismissive in the way that men sometimes get when they've never been told no by anyone who mattered. He wasn't the disease. The disease was a system I had built with good intentions and bad vision, and it had been running for years before he ever walked into a room and said something I couldn't unhear. The cake in the trash was the moment I finally saw clearly, not because of what Kyle did, though that was its own kind of answer, but because of what Claire didn't do. She looked at the floor. She had been looking at the floor for a long time, I realized. I just hadn't wanted to see it. What I did after that night was not about revenge. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I didn't call Frank to hurt anyone. I called Frank because I finally understood that I had been participating in something dishonest, and I needed to stop. The money wasn't love. It had become a way of avoiding the harder conversation, which is, I see who you are becoming, and I will not pretend it's fine. Removing the quarterly distributions, stepping back from Kyle's professional network, restructuring the trust, none of that was designed to destroy anyone. It was designed to stop propping up a fiction. What people do with real ground under their feet is their own business. Some people rise, some people don't, but at least it's theirs. Claire rising. That was the thing I hadn't let myself hope for. When she came home in November and sat at the kitchen table and laughed at something real, I understood that the person I'd been protecting all those years was still in there. She hadn't gone anywhere. She'd just been inside a structure I'd built around her, and when the structure changed, she had room to move again. Intelligence isn't just knowing things. It's being honest enough to look at something you built and say, this isn't working, and I am part of why. That took me longer than it should have. I'm 63 and I'm still learning it. What I'd tell that younger man writing checks is this. The deepest form of respect you can show another person is to believe they are capable of handling the truth about themselves, about you, about what is and isn't working. That belief. That's what love actually looks like when it's doing its job. I'm still her father. I always will be. But I'm done being the floor.